Before I field the first question, Jack, I'd like to thank you for your extraordinary persistence and creativity and ingenuity in making it possible for me to get here today. And I really want to salute you and the Dartmouth Libertarians and Voices for Liberty for your leadership on the free speech front, and thank everybody for sharing a beautiful spring Saturday morning. It really gladdens my heart as a free speech crusader.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for being so accommodating and patient while we sorted everything out. And to everybody in the audience, yeah, it's a beautiful day outside. It's early. We go to Dartmouth. It's early on a Saturday after an on-night, so thanks for showing up. Okay, so Professor Strossen, you've spent your life defending freedom of speech in innumerable publications, speeches, as president of the ACLU, in myriad formats. So clearly, this thing, freedom of speech, is valuable to you. And I'm wondering, as a student of philosophy, is free speech intrinsically good? Is it instrumental to some other end? Is it both?
And I have to say, Jack, I am not a philosopher. I am a lawyer and a legal scholar and a civil liberties activist. So it is from those somewhat different perspectives that I defend free speech as the essential bedrock of not only every other freedom, but anything that we want to advocate or pursue in terms of research or scholarship, philosophy, or religion. So what I'm talking about now, of course, is the instrumental view of free speech, but a great legal scholar and activist, Justice Louis Brandeis, interestingly, the first Jewish justice on the Supreme Court, wrote what I think remains the most eloquent defense of free speech and its vital role in our system in what was essentially a dissenting opinion in 1927 that was unanimously endorsed and became a majority opinion by the Supreme Court in 1969 in an ACLU case, I'm proud to say. And I can't do justice to his eloquent language, but he basically said that freedom of speech has both intrinsic value and instrumental value. I've talked about the instrumental value. The intrinsic value is bound up with our not only self-expression, but also self-identity and exploration, that you cannot have freedom of thought. You cannot have any kind of meaningful freedom of choice. You cannot develop your sense of individuality without freedom of speech. Many of us know the famous statement, "I think, therefore I am," from one of the few philosophical philosophers I'm familiar somewhat with. And Anthony Kennedy is not a philosopher, but a Supreme Court justice who was very supportive of free speech in a decision, an important decision, said freedom of human liberty begins with freedom of thought, and freedom of thought begins with freedom of speech. And the first time I read that, it really puzzled me because I thought, isn't it the other way around? Don't you have to be able to think before you can speak? But they really, for those of us who do a lot of writing, and I look at Jack as an accomplished future journalist in this context, that in the process of writing is really essential in developing your thoughts. So if I can just say on a biographical front, since you're invoking my career, I was a very happy law professor. I loved my students. I loved teaching. I got positive teaching evaluations, so they seemed to at least like me. But I decided at the end of 2019 to step down from my law professor position and become a full-time advocate for free speech, because I see it being increasingly embattled from both ends of the political spectrum. And it's not that I think that free speech is in some abstract sense more important than other human rights, but in an instrumental sense, I do see it as being the prerequisite for the meaningful exercise of other human rights.
Thank you for that detailed and eloquent answer. So, this is hosted by the Dartmouth Libertarians. Certainly, we also see free speech as both intrinsically and instrumentally valuable. But, certain forms, seem to be valueless, at least instrumentally. They're not conducive to some truth-seeking mission or sympathetic to recognizing the dignity of other human beings. And I'm thinking of, hate speech and flatly false speech here, lies. Not to get into the complicated concepts of mis and disinformation, which I don't even really know what that means. But hateful and deceitful speech seem inimical to at least the instrumental good of free speech. So why should we defend them as civil libertarians?
There are many, many answers to that question, but let me start with what I think is the linchpin of your question, Jack, and that is the assumption that there is no instrumental value even to hate speech and controversial speech of any sort, including hate speech and disinformation. And I have to say I disagree with that, right? And that's what we're all about, free speech, disagreement. If somebody has hateful ideas, I really want to know about that for a number of reasons in order to be able to try to refute those ideas. And there are many documents, and I'll use hate speech as an example, but one could go through the same kind of analysis about any other kind of controversial speech. And this, by the way, is one of the major arguments that's made by my longtime colleague and friend, Greg Lukianoff, who's CEO of FIRE, Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression. And Greg calls it, I think he calls it like the mirror. If we want to hold a mirror to somebody to know what they are thinking, isn't that a really valuable piece of information? With that information, we can respond in various ways, including trying to change their views, and there are many, very well documented accounts, including some autobiographical, from even former leaders of white supremacist and other hateful organizations who have been redeemed, that's a word that they often use themselves, by people engaging with them and getting them to re-examine and question and ultimately reject their views. There are many organizations that consist of former hate mongers, and one of which is Life After Hate, which is based in Chicago. They devote their entire lives toward trying to dissuade other people, recruit other people out of their hateful organizations. You can't do that if somebody has those ideas and they're not voicing them. Law enforcement, counterintelligence officials often oppose efforts to censor, in particular, hate speech, disinformation, extremist and terrorist speech, to mention a couple other controversial concepts online, because that, for them, the communications are a vital tool for and essential for being able to monitor the communications to see whether there are any actual plans afoot to engage in actual violent or discriminatory conduct. If you outlaw the expression, you are likely to drive at least some of it underground, where you're not getting rid of the negative attitudes, you're making it harder both to change their attitudes and to prevent and respond to any planned negative activity. So I'm sorry for questioning your premise.
My premise was refuted in my mind, so that was quite persuasive.
If we were in a class, I would say, I'm not going to do this to you, but I think this ties into one of your future questions. Well, so what's your strongest counter-argument?
And I was just about to pivot to it. Not exactly a counter, but when we engage with people who are no longer, let's say, furtive bigots, just to continue our example, but outwardly so. Freedom of speech is, a paramount right. It's super important and valuable, but we also have, the freedom of association. And is there a line after which, when somebody crosses it, is there any point at which somebody is beyond the pale, and instead of using our freedom of speech to counter their hate speech and try to convert them to, let's say, be like wholesome people who respect the dignity of other individuals, we dissociate, and kind of along those lines, is there ever a time to cancel or dox somebody?
Excellent questions. So the essence of not only freedom of speech, but also freedom of association and other fundamental freedoms is individual freedom of choice. That means not only the choice to express certain information and ideas, but also the choice not to, right? The freedom to choose with whom we associate includes the freedom to choose not to associate with particular people. And in fact, this is not just a hypothetical issue. We have very serious issues now where governments are trying to compel people forcibly to express certain ideas they disagree with, or to associate with certain individuals whose views they disagree with. And the Supreme Court has consistently said that it's even more violative of the individual dignity and autonomy that are at the root of these freedoms for government to put words in your mouth or to force you into associating with people whose ideas you reject than it is to silence you. In the context of deciding how you should interact with or not interact with somebody whose ideas you reject, that's very much a strategic decision and also a personal decision. I mean, you might not feel like using every possible opportunity as a debating opportunity. You might want to, just have a peaceful, I'm thinking of my friend Erwin Chemerinsky, the dean of Berkeley Law School. I hope you all read this incident where his home was invaded by a disruptive protester, and as I understand it, he and his wife decided this was going to be a celebratory occasion just for celebrating graduation. Erwin and his wife are certainly very much in favor of free speech, but not at that particular time in that particular place. I should say that the stories that I've read of former even leaders of discriminatory organizations who have been weaned away from their views are very, very moving. But I know that I personally, too much free speech has made me very hoarse. I know that I personally would not have the patience that it has taken. So one really good example is Megan Phelps Roper, who was born into the so-called Westboro Baptist Church. I'm sure many of you have heard about it when I tell you their website with the very ugly slur, www.godhatesfags.org. Megan was born into that church, spent her entire youth crusading for its values and, against not only gay people, but members of the military, Catholics, Jews, just about everybody who wasn't a member of the church. And when she was in her early 20s, the family assigned her to go onto social media to try to recruit younger followers. And in that process, in particular, an Orthodox rabbi in Israel started asking her about the Bible verses that her family's church interpreted as showing that, quote, God hates fags. and wasn't didactic, wasn't castigating her, was just questioning her, like a great, Socratic dialogue in a law school class or a philosophy seminar. And through that very extended process of questioning and answering, she came to question and ultimately to repudiate her own views. So I would say, and there are other examples of people who had their whole lives been brought up in these very isolated echo chambers, if you will, but physical echo chambers, who have been weaned away. So I would not give up hope for anybody, but I do recognize that I'm not the person to do it, and I'm so grateful for that rabbi and many others who do devote their lives to these kinds of educational processes.
Yeah, well, thank you for that answer. You brought up echo chambers, and now there's a lot of discussion, particularly with the rise of social media and modes of communication via the internet, epistemic bubbles, echo chambers. These are distinct concepts in the literature. They often get coupled together, and they've motivated government intervention in various ways that have been revealed by the Twitter files and the great reporting by the likes of Barry Weiss and Michael Schellenberger, I think also Matt Taibbi, etc. Hopefully I got all those names right. And I'm wondering, there's certainly a lot of false speech on the internet that can compromise people's health, safety, etc. during times of emergency. Is there any way, thank you, Kevin, is there any way for government and its expert technocrats and whatnot to communicate with these platforms, if not to censor, then maybe to put notices on certain posts, like, hey, the CDC, for example, says that mRNA vaccines are safe. Here's the research. That doesn't seem to violate the First Amendment to me. Is there any way that the government or any agency of the government can kind of lawfully and constitutionally be engaged in this maybe speech monitoring, epistemic role on the internet, or should it just butt out of it entirely?
These are very complex questions, and I recognize that I didn't answer every detailed aspect of your prior question. I wasn't trying to duck it, so if anybody wants a follow-up question, please go ahead. Here I am going to answer one of your premises before I get to the end of the question, which is, and I'm not attributing this to you, Jack, but many people assume that there is a greater problem of so-called disinformation and misinformation online, that there is and on social media in particular, than in other communications media. Assume that the problem of, assuming it is even a problem, so-called echo chambers and filter bubbles are really pervasive problems online, and that people's ideas are being changed and warped, and people are adopting false conspiracy theories as a result of using online media. These are such widespread assumptions, and usually not based on any research or evidence at all. To the very best of my knowledge, every serious study that has been done, including by very respected internet experts at Oxford and Cambridge and Harvard and other respected institutions, has shown that these assumptions are unfounded, that the problems of disinformation and sorting into ideological groups and being exposed only to very selective disinformation or conspiracy theories, if anything, are less prevalent online than in conventional media. For a review, kind of a meta-study of all the studies that have been done, I commend to you a recent report by a project called The Future of Free Speech, which is based at Vanderbilt University. It's headed by my FIRE colleague Jakob Mikshangama, who had formerly founded and still heads a research institute in Denmark. But it culls together all of the data which show that the problem is greatly exaggerated. Now, that's not to say that it isn't a problem, but if we exaggerate the scope of the problem, that results in an exaggerated and distorted government response. So I think we want to be very, very careful.
Crisis and Leviathan.
Exactly,
yeah.
exactly, a moral panic. Now, you raise a really important issue that is before the Supreme Court. In a couple of cases, we had oral argument recently. Sensibly, government officials are permitted to have their own First Amendment rights to engage in efforts to persuade social media platforms as well as other communications platforms not to convey certain ideas or information or speakers because it might do some damage. I mean, a very conventional example that from conventional media that's quite well known is the Nixon administration trying to persuade the New York Times and the Washington Post not to publish the Pentagon Papers, because they said if you publish it, it's going to lead to undermining national security, increased deaths in Vietnam. We were then engaged in a war in Vietnam and so forth. That attempt to dissuade was constitutional, but when the Nixon administration crossed the line and sought a court injunction against the publication when their persuasion didn't work, that did violate the First Amendment according to the Supreme Court. What we're seeing now is a more subtle but still arguable crossing of the line when the government is going beyond persuasion and encouragement and advocating to threatening and coercing and conspiring with the social media companies. You better take down what we consider to be disinformation, what we consider to be conspiracy theories, or we will take away your Section 230 immunity, we will subject you to antitrust enforcement, and so forth. As you can imagine, it's not a scientific distinction, between permitted encouragement and impermissible coercion. It's a very fact-based determination. The lower court judges did find a lot of communications from multiple agencies in the Biden administration to have crossed that line. And from the evidence that I've read, I think the evidence is quite persuasive that the line was crossed. The Supreme Court justices, unfortunately from my perspective, seem to be very skeptical of those arguments. And I know this goes without saying in this group, but it's so important for me to say it because most people are so focused on the bottom line result in a particular case and who the actors are in a particular case. And I can't tell you how many of my friends who support the Biden administration, or at least see it as the least bad alternative, just, they see the name of the case as Emerita, which is part of the Biden administration. They got to root for the Biden administration without understanding that the same power would definitely be exercised by a Trump administration. And in fact, when Trump was president, he was using his presidential powers of persuasion, perhaps shading into coercion to try to pressure social media companies. The goal was somewhat different. He was complaining that they were taking down too many conservative voices, but there is a principled issue here at stake, and what the Supreme Court does is going to be, have an enormous impact on the actual availability of unfiltered, uncensored information for all of us.
So you made this distinction between, jawboning, which is arguably, I'd argue that that's what the Biden administration was doing with these social media companies, and the Trump administration to this other end. and coercion, and persuasion, and that the latter, persuasion, is okay for institutions, even institutions as powerful as the state governments and the federal government and their agencies to do vis-a-vis private actors. And now I'm thinking, kind of analogously, we're on a college campus. This is an institution. There are agents here that are more powerful than us, administrators, professors, etc. Do you think that in institutions such as a university, a college, whether public or private, and maybe there's a distinction between those two in your answer, should maintain institutional neutrality on political and ethical and whatever geopolitical issues, and corollary, even if the institution formally should do so, must professors?
Oh, this is a great, you're a great interviewer because you do these wonderful segues. It's fantastic. And since you mentioned Dartmouth, yes, of course, I'm very happy to be here at Dartmouth. I'm wearing Dartmouth green in your honor. I like to wear the school colors, but I'm especially happy to do it when the school has pretty colors, so thank you for that. Institutional neutrality. So first, let me start with the important distinction between public and private, because that's a very pervasive issue that isn't as well understood as it should be. The First Amendment itself directly applies only to government institutions and government officials, including public universities. So a private college such as Dartmouth has no First Amendment obligation at all to protect any free speech rights of any member of its community, student, faculty, or otherwise. However, Dartmouth, along with the overwhelming majority of private higher educational institutions, has voluntarily chosen to adhere to the same free speech standards that it would be required to adhere to were it a public university. And forgive me, I haven't looked at Dartmouth's policies recently, but if it's typical, on the website, in student handbooks, in faculty handbooks, and other publications that are widely distributed, including to people who are considering applying for admission here or applying for jobs here, those statements of fidelity to free speech and academic freedom principles, which are usually adhered to by private sector institutions as consistent with the university, with the campus's truth-seeking mission, as consistent with its pedagogical goals in stimulating critical inquiry on the part of the students. Those become enforceable as a matter of contract law. So FIRE has brought many successful lawsuits against private institutions, not because they are directly bound by the First Amendment, but because they are contractually bound by these declarations of commitments to adhere to those principles. Now, institutional neutrality, whose most famous statement was the 1967 Calvin Principles at the University of Chicago. I'm going to focus on the aspect that deals with statements by university officials. There's a whole other dimension that has to do with investments, which I think raises other issues, but what's been in the forefront lately are these statements that heads of universities or even departments and other leaders feel compelled to make with respect to every public controversy, most recently the events unfolding after the massacre on October 7th. And as a result of the embarrassment that university and college leaders have faced because of the unhappiness from all sides of the substantive debates, I think they just agree that these statements can never be satisfactory. There has been a renewed zeal on the part of many campuses to seriously consider adopting a principle of institutional neutrality. Let me commend to your attention, if you haven't yet read it, the Calvin Principles, which are easily available, very concise, very persuasive. And just as you suggest, Jack, the main impetus for maintaining neutrality on the part of the institution itself is precisely to avoid the potential chilling effect on individual members of the campus community when there is an official orthodoxy on one of these controverted issues that's being endorsed by the leadership of the university. Even worse, if it's the leadership of a department where a department chair has much more power over even tenured faculty members, let alone untenured faculty members. And I think there's, the Calvin Principles, the statement refutes all of the arguments, anticipates and refutes the arguments against it, such as, oh, the university is so, or the college is so insensitive to and indifferent to the very serious human rights problems and the very serious police abuse problems and, problems of alleged genocide and so forth. No, it is precisely because the university so deeply is committed to the fullest and most vibrant and diverse discussion and debate about these critically important issues on the part of the members of its community, that it's for that reason that the university desists from purporting to speak on behalf of everybody. The Calvin Principles are sensibly limited in this respect. If there is a public policy issue that directly affects the university itself, then there is a responsibility on the part of the university to speak up. So assume, for example, I don't think you're facing this in New Hampshire, but in other states there have been legislative proposals to eliminate the tenure system for higher education institutions. Of course, that directly affects academic freedom on campuses, and in that situation, the higher education institution would have not only a right but a duty to speak, even consistent with the institutional neutrality approach.
And what do you think about, professors taking positions? I'm a libertarian, I'm a philosophy student here. Most of my philosophy professors are not libertarians. Many of them are, some kind of leftist, critical theorist, Marxist, and I profit from that epistemically. I learn a lot from my professors, challenging in a, Socratic, philosophical way my priors, my conclusions, my argumentation, and I really have never been treated badly. I have certainly never been, graded in an unfair manner. And I think that this is largely the experience, I hope so, of everybody else at Dartmouth, at least. Do you think it's inappropriate for professors in kind of departments that are inherently normative? If you're taking an ethics course, your philosophy professor is going to have a take on it, whether they choose to reveal it or not, that is normative in nature, as opposed to, a course on geology or physics. Not to editorialize, but I don't see anything wrong with that. I'm not intimidated. We're all adults here, or I don't think there are many minors on campus. Maybe there are some 17-year-olds, but we're effectively all adults. Can't we, just like it's profitable to disagree between peers, isn't it also profitable to disagree with your professor?
Absolutely, you should disagree with your professor. And one of I mentioned before this started that I regularly speak to high school teachers and middle school teachers, and one teacher I remember said that her methodology at the beginning of every class is to say to her challenge to the students is, prove me wrong. That's her mode of teaching. She throws out, and even if it's something that she thinks she's right, it's the student's job to try to prove that she's wrong, and I fully support that method of pedagogy. There's nothing inappropriate at all with a teacher or professor revealing his point of view, but that is a matter of academic freedom, the autonomy of each of us as individual instructors to decide what is the most effective mode of stimulating the dialogue and debate and critical thinking. And in my practice, Jack, I do not reveal what my own views are because any more than I ask my students to reveal their views, because this is not some kind of jam session among friends where we're trying to, share what our own perspectives are. It is an exercise in A, learning what all the different perspectives and arguments and evidence are, and B, working with it. So in a law school class, I'll tell you what my mantra for my students is, but I think it's something that would work in every social science and humanities class, and certainly even going down into secondary institutions, not only post-secondary. My mantra for my students is that you must be able to understand, articulate, and advocate all plausible perspectives on all issues that we discuss. And plausible perspectives means that it's supported by the relevant authority. The provision in the Constitution, how it's interpreted, Supreme Court precedents, analyzing and enforcing that provision in the Constitution, the different opinions, not only the majority opinion, but concurring and dissenting opinions as well. And quite frankly, I don't care which one you think is more persuasive. It is your job as a law student and as a future advocate to be able to make all of those arguments, which, as I said, I alluded to earlier. It's okay, what's your best counter argument? And I also don't think it's that relevant to students where I happen to land on a particular issue on a particular day. If students are interested in what professors have publicly opined on issues, they can easily find it thanks to the wonders of the internet. But hopefully we all continue to be open-minded and continue to seek to be open to changing our perspectives. A political science professor that I know is writing a book. I don't know how far the book is, but he had chosen the title, and I think the title is just fantastic. It is, "What would it take for me to change my mind?" And I love that question because there has to be an answer to that. For every question, each of us has to be able to come up with an answer. If I can say one other thing about the potential chilling effect of professors, and I'm so happy to hear what you say about, not surprised, about your professors at Dartmouth not creating a chilly climate and welcoming different perspectives. That is typical. FIRE, together with College Pulse for the past 5 years, has been doing very detailed surveys and analyses of the free speech climate on campuses all across the United States. The most recent one came out in October. It evaluated 248 campuses. It's quite well known now that Harvard came out number 248, but one of the most distressing aspects of that report was that for all of the differences between the campus that was ranked number 1, which was a technical university in Michigan. Chicago is no longer number 1. And number 248 was Harvard. They were very, very different in terms of policies, in terms of administrative actions, in terms of deplatforming and retaliatory efforts against unpopular perspectives and so forth. But here, to me, of all of the sobering aspects of that report, the single most sobering was the following statement, which I've committed to memory, that the difference between number 1 and number 248 on the particular vector of the campus climate for free speech was negligible. So that even at the school that has the strongest pro-free speech policies, the students are engaging in the most severe self-censorship, not daring to discuss hugely important topics, including abortion and gun control, as well as race and gender. And the reason for that self-censorship was not because of fear of professors. The students said no, they're not afraid that the professor is going to discriminate against them in any way at all. It was peer pressure that was the silencing factor.
Lighten up, guys. Come on, be more tolerant.
And you know, that's why I'm was so happy to be able to get out of bed at 5 in the morning to get here, because that is an aspect of, you know, an essential prerequisite for meaningful free speech that cannot be solved by professors or by university presidents. That has to come from the students yourselves. You create your own culture, your own peer culture that celebrates and encourages dissent and dispute and different ideological viewpoints.
And speaking of the students themselves and my great transitions, I would now like to open up the floor to questions from the audience, not just students, community members, and my parents are here, so my parents are also welcome to ask questions, as well as other parents. Yeah, the floor is yours, and I will just repeat the question into the mic on my tie. You, please.
Thank you very much for your wonderful speech. I have a question. You said that studies doesn't show that social media create like pool of people with a certain views, so that like basically said that social media do not create controversial theories. Does the studies like got the Americans or maybe like people from Western Europe? Did they study like people from Asia, like from very religious like communities, like say in the Middle East?
Okay, so the question is about echo chambers and the empirical studies about them on the internet that Professor Strossen invoked earlier, and whether those studies included like not foreign necessarily, non-American sources.
Yeah, and thank you so much. And I don't want to overstate the studies that I was referring to. They did not say there are no problems. They just said the problems have been exaggerated vis-a-vis other media and how significant their impact is, how many people are affected by it. The answer is certainly the studies go beyond the United States, because some of them were done by European universities. As to whether they extend to Asia or other parts of the world, I don't know. I would hope so, I would assume so, given the global nature of the internet, but that is a very, very important question. And again, for an easy access to citations to all the studies that have been done, go to the Future of Free Speech website.
Riley.
Yeah, I want to build on that question about websites. You mentioned how there's like this free speech of the internet, right? But there are also immense botting crises where AI and thousands and hundreds of thousands of people represent one single opinion. Without some kind of internet regulation, these companies have to regulate themselves, but without the government intervening, then they don't usually do that good of a job, right? So how could we create these online platforms that are just not dominated by people with these political aims that use these botting farms to sell things and change how people think?
So let me say first of all that those.
Can you just repeat
I'm so
the
sorry.
question?
You're better.
Okay, I'll repeat the question.
Yeah.
So the question is about, do we need government regulation to deal with the threat, the budding threat of like bot farms and AI drowning out other viewpoints just through sheer volume of representation of one viewpoint over others? Is that a fair paraphrase?
Yeah. And I'm going to answer your question at a more general level, because those of us who defend free speech, including myself, but much more importantly, the United States Supreme Court. And let me pause there for a second, because it's very well publicized how deeply divided the justices are on many constitutional issues, including some free speech issues. But since the second half of the 20th century, the court has been virtually unanimous on all of the fundamental free speech principles that I've been talking about here, despite an enormous ideological diversity among the justices. And I say that not to show that therefore these free speech principles are right, 100% of them could be wrong, but I think it is an important data point that regardless of very, very different views on policy issues and on many constitutional law and other legal issues, the justices keep coming back to the touchstone of free speech. And one of the themes that is predominant is a recognition of enormous harm that can be done by free speech. And it's a harm that is, a potential harm that is revisited in the context of every new medium to reach the court's attention. People understandably become concerned about the enhanced power of this communications medium to reach more and more people, including more and more children. And regardless of the particular type of controversial or potentially dangerous information that society fears at a particular point in history, the court continues to acknowledge that great as the potential harm of unregulated free speech is, the potential harm of government regulation is even greater. And that has been proven, in my opinion, so far, because I continue to try to the best of my human ability to be open-minded to new evidence, but evidence from the past and ongoing to this day continues to convince me that government has so many incentives to enforce any standard that gives it discretion in a way that will promote its own policy agenda and disproportionately silence dissenters, disproportionately silence those who lack power, including various ethnic and religious and racial and other minorities. And you see that very dramatically in the context of the pandemic and COVID, when you look at including the informal pressures that were exerted by Biden administration officials against, even very serious, respected medical authorities and scientific researchers when their analyses of what the causes were and what the best therapeutic and public policy responses are. Anything that disagreed with government opinion was silenced as, quote, disinformation. So, that's the overall context, and if I can use one other example of a past regulatory policy, which sounds so good, and a lot of people have said, well, why couldn't we do this for the internet? It was the so-called fairness doctrine for broadcast media, which was heavily regulated over-the-air television and radio, which for most of the 20th century were by far the dominant, most powerful media, absolutely essential for every political campaign. Who could object to fairness, right? Including equal treatment of different perspectives. And every study that has been done, to the best of my knowledge, showed, not surprisingly, that every single presidential administration enforced the so-called fairness doctrine in a very unfair manner to take away, or at least threaten, broadcast licenses for any station that was critical of administration policies, whether it was John Kennedy as a Democrat or Richard Nixon as a Republican or anybody else. So I think there are very serious problems. I'm very skeptical about government regulation as a solution. In terms of AI, it has ramped up the people's awareness of the indispensable importance of the most rigorous education in media literacy and information literacy. There is even the most, authoritarian, totalitarian government in the world has never been able to completely suppress all information that it considers to be dangerous. So we individuals are still going to be confronted with some information out there that's disinformation, that is hateful speech. As I was waiting for this to start this morning, I was reading about very distressing incidents of fake nude images that are fake of high school girls and middle school girls. I mean, there's all kinds of evil disinformation out there, and we have to learn to develop a healthy skepticism toward everything that is thrown at us. By the way, not only in social media, but dare I say, in traditional print media and broadcast media as well.
I think we have time for one final question. Sorry, Mom, I can't choose you. That would be nepotistic. And Mariana, you're also my friend. Aiden, you're also my... Okay, I don't know who you are, so you get the question.
I can call on your parents.
No, but we're going to go with you back there.
Thank you. So you mentioned Megan Phelps-Roper. I think she's actually, her recent podcast on J.K. Rowling, great example of a recent phenomenon. I'm sure it's not just recent, but that I've noticed recently, where criticism of J.K. Rowling for her transphobic views has sort of been portrayed as censorship. So I'd like to know what you think. When does that sort of, overwhelming response of criticism rise to the level of censorship, in your opinion? And if it does rise to that level, what should we do about it?
So when does criticism rise to the level of censorship is the question, with the example of J.K. Rowling and the backlash to her being a TERF, if that is what she is. Yeah.
Thank you for that last part, because I also wanted to question the premise. First of all, I, of course, would defend transphobic views, despite having, of course, advocated for the rights of trans people, just the way I defend hateful anti-Semitic speech, despite being Jewish, and defending, of course, freedom from anti-Semitism and other discrimination. But from what among other things, this podcast, The Witch Trial of J.K. Rowling, which I thought was phenomenal, really deepened and complexified my view as to what her views actually are. And I'm not sure that they could fairly be described as transphobic. But be that as may, your question was another one which you had also asked earlier, Jack, and that is, isn't a lot of what is called cancellation an exercise of free speech, which should be defended? And the answer is yes. I wrote a whole book called Hate, Why We Should Resist It with Free Speech, Not Censorship. I was calling on people, urging them to please raise your voices against speech that you consider to be hateful, transphobic, among other things. That said, the fact that you have a right to say something does not mean that it is right to do so. And if we are concerned about creating not only free speech laws and policies that are protective, but also a culture that is protective of free speech, right? The example that I went back to on campuses, where the problem is by and large not policies that, although there are too many anti-hate speech policies, but even on campuses that have great policies, the problem is that there is a culture of self-suppression. Let me quote one of my friends who's an undergraduate at the University of Chicago, great advocate of free speech, and she's written publicly about this in an issue of Sapir, a journal that was founded by Bret Stephens a few years ago. And it's focused on Jewish audiences and issues. And a couple of years ago, they had a special collection called Jews and Cancel Culture, and my undergraduate friend, who is Jewish, Olivia Gross, wrote an essay about what the experience was on campus. And she said that she and her free speech buddies, and even at the vaunted University of Chicago, before they raise their hand in class, or even before they speak to each other in a setting such as a school cafeteria, because they have been subject to cancellation campaigns, before they do that, they say, is it worth it? Before opening your mouth. And every time, I have to say rationally, the answer is probably no. Because what you have to lose is so much greater than what you have to gain. And when Olivia was asked by Brett Stevens to contribute to this collection, and she wrestled with whether she should accept it, because among other things, she was going to be included in a publication that had another essay by Joshua Katz from Princeton, who had been accused of sexual harassment. And at the end of her essay, she says, even as I'm about to send this off, I am hesitating about whether I should hit the send button. So we have to we have to exercise our judgment to be robustly critical. I think we should not desist from voicing our views that are critical of somebody that we think is engaging in dangerous, hateful, disinformation or other controversial speech, but not to be so disproportionately harsh that these people are going to reasonably fear social ostracism at best, but losing research assistantships, letters of recommendation, even being suspended from school or being suspended from your job. So I think we have to, yes, we do have a right, but we should be cognizant of the downside of over harshly exercising that right.
Well, I think that's a great place to leave things. As Professor Strossen alluded to earlier, she woke up at 5 a.m. to drive all the way here to join us. So if we could give her a big round of applause.